Good morning, afternoon or evening. Welcome to this series of videos on Zero Trust architecture and Zero Trust networking. My name is Tony Kirkham. The concept of Zero Trust has been around for slightly over a decade now, so it's not actually new. A quick Google search shows many spins on Zero Trust, most of which have got something to do with a product. The purpose of this video is help to decipher what it's all about. It seems every security vendor has a different perspective of Zero Trust, and this is okay as individual products are required as part of any architecture. To be clear, Zero Trust is not a product, it's a strategy, a framework, an architecture used to create this concept called Zero Trust. So what I do want to provide from these videos is, firstly, I want to start with the purpose of Zero Trust. And then I want to provide an architecture-centric perspective and interpretation of Zero Trust. What is it about? What problems does it address? Why may it be beneficial to my organisation? While this video will focus on the purpose of Zero Trust, my real interest is in the architectural and deployment approaches. So in a subsequent video or videos, I will discuss the architectural approaches and provide some practical guidance on how to embark on a Zero Trust initiative. So let's start with the Zero Trust history and then look at why Zero Trust. Originally, a significant amount of the pre-work came out of what was then known as the Jericho Forum. The Zero Trust framework itself was developed by John Kindervag while he was at Forrester. Forrester is still very much trying to lead the initiatives. Chase Cunningham is the current Forrester lead. But stepping back, Kindervag argued that excessive trust was a root cause of many intrusions and breaches. So Zero Trust focuses on ensuring that trust relationships aren't exploited. Let me provide some excessive trust examples. The first and most obvious is openly routable internal networks, where insufficient network segmentation allows both users and systems to have unnecessary reachability to other systems. And this certainly has the potential for users to access systems which they may not have a legitimate need, and attacks to easily propagate internally, where a compromise can easily move from one system to another. This general scenario also includes remote access VPNs, many of which have widely open internal access. And this can be particularly risky, particularly if something like split tunneling is used, where a compromised user device out on the open internet could become a conduit into the internal network, which then may have quite wide reach. And then on the identity side, some excessive trust examples can include single-factor authentication is probably the most prevalent, where a username and a password is the sole source of trust. This presents the obvious risk of shared or compromised credentials, but with it being particularly high risk for admin and privilege accounts, this is again excessive trust, and it's open to privilege abuse and can facilitate the easy internal propagation of an attack. And then don't forget service accounts as well. Service accounts are a soft target for attackers, particularly if common credentials are used across multiple systems. So Zero Trust fundamentally proposes a framework which assumes that no level of trust in the design process. Still, the reality, or the world as we know it today, is all too often security architectures are very perimeter-centric. Think a castle, a moat, and maybe some hot oil. What I trust and what I don't trust. If you're on the inside, you're trusted. The bad guys are on the outside in the big bad internet. And then there's this area called the demilitarized zone, or DMZ, where you put your disposable assets. And then there's this thing called a firewall that keeps the bad guys out. Maybe the IPS is the hot oil. But for several years now, the perimeter has been getting very blurry, and this whole architectural foundation is quite inadequate. Once someone gets an internal foothold, they can usually move laterally with ease. This might be an oversimplification, as many organisations do utilise internal segmentation, but often it's just in the data centre, and often it's too little, or the segmentation models are very old, dated, and of limited effectiveness. Certainly every major high-profile breach without fail occurred by an attacker getting a foothold on something that wasn't deemed important, and then they moved internally, usually without being noticed, until they got to something they did. Then they exfiltrated that critical data out of the organisation without being noticed. It is important to understand that the data is the most important word here. Those people didn't end up in the news because they were breached. They were in the news because the data was stolen. So one side point I would make here is controlling what leaves is as important as protecting the threats that can get in. One of the challenges with Zero Trust has been the lack of publicly available comprehensive definitions, as well as design and deployment material. Forrester are the people who created Zero Trust and are driving it from a solution approach. However, they charge around $745 to purchase the blueprint, which is called a Practical Guide to Zero Trust Implementation. So if you have much deeper pockets than me, I'd be interested to know what's in it and what it's like. On the positive side, NIST recently released Special Publication 800-207 titled Zero Trust Architecture. Certainly it's a good start, but personally I found it both a heavy read and very abstract. So nonetheless, there's some very good information contained in it. But being fairly abstract, quite a lot is left open to interpretation. Before I move on to the principles of Zero Trust, let's just review today's landscape and ask the question, what do we have to design for? So these are some of the architectural considerations. So today, attacks are very commonplace, persistent, and often sophisticated, although many will just still exploit gaps in the basics. We have application infrastructures, which are more complex and more mission critical at the same time than they were previously. We see 24/7 operations are very commonplace. We have public integration to public cloud, global outsourcing, highly mobile workforces, and increased interconnection to external business partners. These are all major changes in the last 5 years. So these factors are all redefining the concept of a perimeter. So we still have legacy, and then on top of that we still have legacy applications. Many of these were built on obsolete and insecure operating systems, and they're going to be with us for some time to come. And they must be considered in the security architecture. And there's this very solid trend for the move from private data centers to the public cloud. So there's no surprises in any of this. But at the same time, we have this journey from a server world to a serverless world. New software architectures are becoming common, for example, containers and serverless applications. These bring with them a very high speed of change. So for example, when VMs were introduced in the first place, they were being turned up and turned down very frequently, as well as being frequently created and destroyed. And containers are only increasing that velocity. So environments are becoming far more dynamic now in nature than they were in the past. Let's now have a look at the underlying principles of Zero Trust. And I have tried to boil these down as simply as possible. And this is my interpretation of it. But firstly, a comment. Zero Trust can be viewed as an additional set of principles that can be applied in the design process. So these are in addition to principles such as least privilege, confidentiality, integrity, availability, defense in depth, compartmentalized design, and things like that. So let's have a look at my interpretation of the principles. Firstly, the network is always assumed to be hostile. Both external and internal threats exist on the network at all times. Network locality is not sufficient for deciding trust in the network. So location is not an attribute of security. It's not an identity. So for example, if I lived at 123 Elm Street and so did my dog, which one of us would you want to trust? Move the protect surface as close to the information asset as possible. And this is probably the most important principle in the architectural evolution. This principle also aligns with Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, which is a related but separate initiative coming out of Gartner. And I'll look to do something specifically on that in the future. The next is every device, user, and network flow is authenticated and authorized. and then access is provided on a least privilege basis. Those policies must be dynamic and calculated from as many sources as possible. So there are potentially many parameters which can be considered in determining the trust level of a connection, beyond both location or IP address. The next is you must log and inspect all traffic. And finally, never trust and always verify. So this is really in contrast to the paradigm of trust but verify, which in practice is a bit of a joke, because there's lots of trusting and not much verifying. A key point from NIST 800-207 essentially states that perimeter models alone are no longer effective or have even failed. And there are many organisations today who are still heavily invested in the perimeter. And as I've alluded, this is probably the most significant single takeaway from Zero Trust is that perimeter-only approaches are obsolete. Let me now do a brief architectural overview. The two most key Zero Trust architectural elements are a policy enforcement point and a policy decision point. Basically, they sit in front of some protected resource. And it's analogous to a security checkpoint in an airport in validating if access to that resource is allowed. So basically, an untrusted environment is on the left, and then once a connection is validated, the session is considered trusted and allowed onto the right. So let's look at the general architectural approaches used to establish a Zero Trust based architecture. There currently appears to be three of them. The first is network segmentation or microsegmentation. And these are typically done using tight next-generation firewall controls and inspection. This type of approach generally seems to be fairly well understood, but I'll focus more on this in a subsequent video. But basically, rather than just using the typical 5-tuple based rules, you go into understanding both the application and the source user's identity, and those can be used before the connection can be allowed through. The second approach is software-defined perimeter. This was something that was created by the Cloud Security Alliance some years ago. So software-defined perimeters require endpoints to authenticate and be authorized first before obtaining network access to a protected entity. Then encrypted connections are created in real time between the requesting system and the application infrastructure. So conceptually this is fairly similar to network access control or NAC. And basically the resources are kept dark until the connection is established, so they're not visible to people externally. The third is this thing called application access proxies, also known as identity-aware proxies. Essentially a proxy is placed in front of the resource, which allows access after sufficient credentials are presented and other conditions are met. Now, maybe there's a fourth, maybe there's a fifth, and if people have any strong thoughts on that, please let me know. I want to comment on identity in general, as it is a very key foundational element. Because under Zero Trust, all network traffic must be authenticated to prove the user and the device is legitimate, and additionally encrypted, so to cryptographically prove the source and destination, while also protecting the confidentiality of the connection. So identity becomes a very important element in any Zero Trust initiative. So if I read a NIST draft quote, user credentials are insufficient for device authentication to an enterprise resource. So this effectively means multi-factor authentication. And it is considerably stronger than passwords and all the issues that come with them. And then these can also be combined with certificates, both user and device certificates, and possibly making use of 802.1x. I'll call particular attention to admin accounts as well, as it's been well documented across many successful breaches that weak admin credentials have been a key element which has enabled the success of those attacks. This highlights just how critical MFA is in protecting privileged accounts. We also need to consider the issue of establishing the identity of workloads themselves. This would include both VMs and containers. This would need to occur in a dynamic environment where these things are being potentially stood up and down at a very frequent rate. So as a philosophy, there is sound logic behind zero trust, but there are also some concerns and considerations. First is the potential for additional complexity. So many environments are highly complex today, and we don't want to add to that. We want to use any initiative in this space to simplify and strengthen, not to make things more complex with no improvement in security posture. Scaling is something that has to be considered in any design. Then there is the security of the zero trust infrastructure and systems themselves. When you have any centralized function which controls large blocks of security operations, the security and the protection of those devices and systems becomes absolutely critical. So you must ensure you don't just move the weakest link to a new place, and this is something which will require care within the design process. Then there's the lack of publicly available reference architectures. So this is probably my biggest concern, is the lack of those reference architectures and the associated tool sets. As I mentioned initially, Zero Trust has been around for a long time and there is still not much out there to work from. So this in turn has the potential to impact the ease of deployment. So for Zero Trust to become mainstream, there will need to be community collaboration, much like occurs in the IETF or the Internet Engineering Task Force, the people who produce all the RFCs. Then this of course leads on to the ease at which organisations can deploy Zero Trust architectures. So from what I have seen, the people who have successfully deployed Zero Trust have had deep pockets. And there's very little out there in terms of how you would design and execute a significant Zero Trust project, particularly in complex 24/7 operations. So this should not put people off, but I'd certainly like to see more field experience being shared. And a quick final comment. Keep in mind, it's a whole lot easier to build a brand new greenfield environment than it is to go and migrate an existing environment which may be providing services on a 24/7 basis. So at this point, I'll leave it there, and in the next video, I'll discuss some of the architecture options in slightly more depth. Then following on with some practical deployment guidance. It does take a considerable time to produce these videos, so if this has been helpful, I would greatly appreciate a like or a comment. Thank you.